Hi, I'm Mike Buehler, and welcome to Boston Rare Maps YouTube channel. One of the most frequent questions I'm asked is, how do I know a map is real? Meaning, how do I know the maps I'm handling aren't simply fakes produced on some laser printer yesterday? And what I'm going to do is focus on copper engraved maps published roughly between 1500 and say 1825, because that's pretty much the most common printing method encountered in the antiquarian market. What I'm holding here is an original engraved copper plate for a view of Boston. First, an engraver used very sharp tools to incise an image in a copper plate in reverse, so that when it was printed on a piece of paper, it would appear properly oriented. And then send it to the printer. The printer would ink the plate, then actually wipe the plate off, so only ink would remain in the incised areas. And then the plate would be pressed at extremely high pressure onto a dampened sheet of paper in a printing press. And the pressure, was so high that the paper would be forced into the incised areas where it would pick up the ink that had been left when the plate was inked, thereby producing a copper plate engraving. Understanding this process, one can then look for certain telltale signs on what is supposed to be an early printed map and make a determination about whether it's authentic or not. So now let's look at an original engraved copper plate map. So by way of example, what we have here is a very rare map of Vermont produced in Germany in 1796. We know this map to have been produced by the copper plate engraving process. The first question is, does the map look old? On the one hand, is the paper bright white, like the paper that comes out of your laser printer, or does it have a nice creamy look to it, like on this map? Are there signs of age, like, for example, roughness around the edges, or little specks and spots? Are there areas of discoloration? And in this case, the answer to all those questions is yes. It looks old. Now let's look at the paper. Does the paper feel old? To my hands, which have felt a lot of maps from the 18th century, the paper has a nice kind of rough feel to it in the way of old handmade paper, unlike modern paper, which tends to be smooth. And it's also very heavy, which again is what you would expect from a German map of this period. Until about 1775 or 1800, all maps were printed on what's called laid or hand laid paper. And the way this paper was made was an entirely craft or hand done process. They would take old rags and old cotton cloth of all sorts, chop it up, and mix it in water with a few other chemicals to create kind of what you might call a slurry. That slurry would then be laid upon a screen in a very thin layer and allowed to dry. And et voila. That dried sheet was a piece of early laid paper. One sure sign of early laid paper is that it bears the impression of that wire screen upon which the slurry was laid. If I were to lift up this map and hold it to light, from my angle, I can see a very faint impression of heavy lines running horizontally, spaced about an inch apart, and finer lines running vertically, spaced very, very closely together. So as I explained earlier, the ink copper plate was impressed at very high pressure against the sheet of damp paper to produce the printed map. That impression left, or that act of pressing left what's called a plate mark, where the very edge of the copper plate bit into the paper. And that plate mark appears as an indentation, usually no more than a few millimeters or maybe half an inch outside the printed border of the map. If a map that should be the result of a copper plate engraving doesn't have a plate mark, run the other way. It's a reproduction or a fake. The one last thing I'd like to talk about is print quality. This one's a little tougher, requires a little more experience looking at maps and prints, but with just a little bit of time and practice, you can really master it. If you get close anywhere in an engraved image and you look at the engraved lines, they should be very crisp and distinct from one another. So for example, if one were to zoom in to the V in Vermont, you can see that there are individual lines shading the left arm of the V. If this was a modern reproduction done by some kind of photographic process, those shaded lines would be, as it were, smushed together and just appear kind of fuzzy gray. Likewise, these what we call molehills, which are actually designed to show areas of elevation, rely on a series of hundreds of individual lines. In a modern reproduction, these would be smushed, as it were, smushed or merged together and appear gray or almost black, instead of as a bunch of separate, distinct lines. To review then, the features that you could look for, or the questions you might ask yourself when trying to determine whether a map is really an original engraved map are: A, does it look old? B, is it on the right kind of paper? That is it on laid paper that's nice and heavy and crisp? C, does it have a plate mark running around the outside? And D, does it have a nice crisp image quality, the way a copper engraving should? Thank you for watching this video. If you would like to learn more about Boston Rare Maps and the rare maps and prints we have available for sale, visit us at bostonraremaps.com. While you're there, you can use the contact page to subscribe to our mailing list for regular announcements of new acquisitions and upcoming events of interest to map lovers. Please feel free to leave a like or a comment, or to subscribe to the Boston Rare Maps YouTube channel to receive alerts about new videos as they become available.